"You're nothing." The words sliced through the corridor of the Al-Hakim Tower as Sheikh Rashid Al-Hakim stood in his pristine white kandura and traditional gutra, his face twisted with rage as he pointed at the black woman in mailroom worker uniform who had accidentally stepped into his path while delivering inter-office documents. Maya Johnson stood holding her stack of mail and packages, her work uniform marking her as one of the building's least visible employees, her face showing dignified composure, despite being publicly berated by the billionaire who owned the entire 50-story building where she worked. But there was something in her careful grip on the documents she carried, a protective way she held the stack against her chest, that suggested she understood these weren't just routine mail deliveries. Sheikh Rashid's voice rose with each insult, calling her careless for nearly bumping into him, calling her stupid for not watching where she was going, calling her nothing, absolutely nothing, in the grand scheme of his important business empire. Behind them, office workers who had stepped into the corridor froze, watching uncomfortably as their boss humiliated a mailroom worker over a minor hallway encounter. In Maya's hands, partially visible among the stack of envelopes and inter-office pouches, was a document marked confidential, financial records she had been assigned to deliver to the legal department for review, papers that would prove what she had already suspected after 3 months of handling sensitive documents that weren't as carefully secured as they should have been. What happened in the next 72 hours would cost Sheikh Rashid his company, his freedom, and his entire fortune, all because he had publicly humiliated and threatened the one person who had seen enough evidence while delivering his internal mail to understand the massive fraud he was perpetrating, and his moment of casual cruelty had transformed her from someone who might have stayed silent into someone determined to ensure the right authorities saw exactly what she was holding. Maya Johnson had been working in the mailroom of Al-Hakim Tower for 3 months, one of dozens of support staff who kept the massive office building functioning, while remaining essentially invisible to the executives and professionals who worked in the upper floors. She arrived each morning at 6, sorted incoming mail and packages, prepared inter-office deliveries, and spent her days moving through the building distributing documents and correspondence to various departments. The work was physically tiring, the pay was modest, and the job itself carried no prestige or recognition, but it was honest employment, and it paid her bills while she figured out her next steps after a complicated period in her life. To the executives and professionals who worked in Al-Hakim Tower, mailroom workers like Maya were functionally invisible. They appeared briefly to deliver documents, were occasionally thanked with barely a glance, and otherwise existed as part of the infrastructure that kept business moving. Nobody asked their names, their stories, their backgrounds, or anything about them beyond whether they had delivered a specific package correctly. Maya had learned quickly that mailroom workers occupied a strange space where they were both essential and completely disregarded, trusted with sensitive documents, but assumed to be too unimportant to understand or care about their contents. But Maya noticed things that invisible people often notice. She handled confidential documents every day, financial reports and legal contracts, and internal memoranda that passed through the mailroom for distribution to various departments. And over 3 months, she had begun recognizing patterns in certain documents that passed through her hands regularly. Financial reports from Sheikh Rashid's private companies that showed revenue figures that seemed inconsistent with each other. Internal memoranda that discussed moving money between accounts in ways that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. Legal documents that referenced offshore entities and complex ownership structures that appeared designed to hide beneficial ownership. She wasn't trained in finance or accounting, but she had worked in enough offices to recognize when documentation looked unusual, when the volume of confidential financial transfers seemed excessive, when the tone of internal communications suggested people were trying to hide something. Sheikh Rashid Al-Hakim was 46, a billionaire who had built his wealth through real estate development, hospitality investments, and financial services across the Gulf region. He owned the Al-Hakim Tower and dozens of other properties, controlled multiple companies, and maintained a public image as a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist. But behind that public image was a sophisticated fraud scheme that had been running for years. He was systematically moving money from his publicly traded companies into private entities he controlled, essentially stealing from minority shareholders and public investors through a complex web of fraudulent transactions disguised as legitimate business expenses and consulting fees. The scheme had made him hundreds of millions in illicit profits, while shareholders and investors lost value, and it had continued successfully because it was sophisticated enough that regular auditors hadn't detected it, and because all the documentation of the fraud was carefully controlled within his own organization. Except that documentation had to move through channels. Contracts had to be filed, financial reports had to be distributed, internal memoranda coordinating the fraud had to reach various departments. And all of that paper flowed through the mailroom where Maya sorted and delivered it, where she had slowly accumulated enough observations to understand something was wrong, even if she couldn't articulate exactly what the fraud mechanism was. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a Thursday morning when Maya was delivering documents to the executive floor. She had an inter-office pouch for the legal department, containing financial records that had been flagged for routine compliance review, standard procedure for publicly traded companies. She was walking through the executive corridor when Sheikh Rashid came around the corner quickly, distracted by his phone, and they nearly collided. Maya stepped back immediately, apologizing, but Sheikh Rashid exploded with disproportionate rage. He began screaming at her in the corridor about being careless, about not watching where she was going, about being stupid and incompetent. Then his eyes fell on her uniform and his contempt deepened. "You're just a mailroom worker," he said with dripping disdain. "You're nothing. You're less than nothing in this building. You exist to deliver papers and stay out of the way of important people. Do you understand that? You are nothing." His voice carried through the corridor, and office workers stopped to watch the billionaire berate the mailroom employee. Some looked uncomfortable, but nobody intervened, because this was Sheikh Rashid's building and challenging him meant risking your own job. Maya stood silent through the entire tirade, her face calm, her grip tight on the documents she was carrying. When he finally dismissed her with a contemptuous wave, adding that he would be speaking to her supervisor about her incompetence and that she should probably start looking for a new job, she simply nodded and continued on to deliver the documents to the legal department as she had been assigned. But something had shifted in that moment. Before, she had observed patterns that concerned her, but had told herself it wasn't her business, that she was just a mailroom worker who didn't understand high-level finance, that she should focus on her job and not make assumptions. But being called nothing, being treated with such contempt by a man whose documents she handled every day, documents that she increasingly suspected contained evidence of serious crimes, that treatment transformed her uncertainty into clarity and her silence into determination. She delivered the financial records to the legal department as assigned. Then she went back to the mailroom, and over the next 2 days, she began a process she had never imagined she would undertake. During quiet periods, she started making copies of documents that passed through her hands, financial reports, and internal memoranda and contracts that she had flagged mentally over 3 months as potentially problematic. She was careful, making copies during off hours when the office was empty, never taking originals, documenting everything she copied with dates and routing information. She didn't fully understand all the technical financial details, but she understood enough to know she was copying evidence of something seriously wrong, evidence that would need to be reviewed by people with expertise in financial fraud. What Sheikh Rashid didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn because mailroom workers were beneath his notice, was that Maya Johnson had a bachelor's degree in business administration from a decent university. She had worked for several years in corporate offices before personal circumstances, including a difficult divorce and subsequent depression, had derailed her career and led her to take whatever work she could find to survive. She wasn't a financial expert, but she was educated enough to recognize fraudulent patterns when she saw them repeatedly, and she was organized enough to systematically document what she was observing. The mailroom job was temporary, a stepping stone while she rebuilt her life, but it had placed her in a position to observe criminal activity that more sophisticated oversight had missed. Within 72 hours of being called nothing in that corridor, Maya had compiled a substantial file of copied documents and had contacted the Securities and Commodities Authority with a detailed letter explaining that she worked in the mailroom of Al Hakim Tower, that she had been handling internal documents for months, and that she believed those documents contained evidence of systematic financial fraud involving the transfer of money from public companies to private entities, controlled by Sheikh Rashid al-Hakim. She provided copies of dozens of documents she had copied, organized chronologically, with notes about routing and patterns she had observed. She explained that she wasn't a financial expert, but that the patterns seemed clearly fraudulent to her and warranted investigation by people with appropriate expertise. The SCA investigators who received her complaint were initially skeptical, but the documentation she provided was substantial enough to warrant preliminary review. When their forensic accountants examined the documents she had copied, they immediately recognized sophisticated accounting fraud. The documents showed money being systematically siphoned from public companies through fake consulting contracts, inflated service fees, and disguised loans to entities that Sheikh Rashid controlled. It was textbook self-dealing and corporate theft, and the documentation Maya had provided gave investigators exactly what they needed to obtain warrants for more comprehensive investigation. Within a week, the SCA had launched a formal investigation into Sheikh Rashid and his companies. Within 2 weeks, they had obtained warrants to seize financial records and computers from his offices. Within 3 weeks, they had frozen his assets and filed preliminary charges. Sheikh Rashid was stunned when investigators appeared at his building with warrants, unable to comprehend how his carefully hidden fraud scheme had been discovered. His lawyers immediately began working to understand where the investigation had originated and what evidence authorities possessed. It took another week before Sheikh Rashid learned the devastating truth. The investigation had been triggered by a complaint from a mailroom worker who had been systematically copying documents that passed through her hands and had provided authorities with evidence that exposed his fraud. When his lawyers showed him Maya's name on the complaint filing, when they explained that a mailroom employee had documented his crimes over months of handling his internal documents, Sheikh Rashid felt his world collapse around him. The woman he had called nothing, the employee he had humiliated and threatened over a hallway encounter, had been the invisible observer who saw everything and ultimately brought everything crashing down. The investigation revealed fraud totaling over $800 million, money systematically stolen from shareholders and investors over 6 years through fake contracts and disguised transactions. Multiple executives in his companies were implicated, and several accepted plea deals requiring them to testify against Sheikh Rashid in exchange for reduced sentences. The evidence was overwhelming, substantially built on the documents Maya had copied and provided, supplemented by computer records and testimony from cooperating witnesses. Sheikh Rashid's public image as a successful entrepreneur was replaced by the reality of a criminal who had stolen hundreds of millions through sophisticated fraud. The trial was extensive and widely covered in regional media. Maya was called as a witness to explain how she had come to possess the documents and what had motivated her to contact authorities. She testified calmly about her job handling sensitive documents, about patterns she had noticed over months, and about being publicly humiliated and threatened by Sheikh Rashid for nearly bumping into him in a hallway. Treatment that had transformed her from someone uncertain about reporting her concerns into someone determined to ensure authorities saw evidence of crimes she believed were being committed. Her testimony was powerful, not because of financial expertise, but because of her credibility and her clear explanation of how invisible workers often observe things that executives assume nobody important is seeing. Sheikh Rashid was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and securities violations. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution exceeding $900 million. His business empire was dismantled, his assets seized, his reputation destroyed. The case became one of the largest corporate fraud prosecutions in Gulf business history. For Maya, consequences were complicated. She lost her mailroom job, as she had expected, when Sheikh Rashid's companies were reorganized under new management. But her role in exposing major fraud became known, and she received substantial whistleblower rewards from regulatory funds. More importantly, her courage and integrity attracted attention from organizations that valued those qualities. She was offered positions in compliance departments and corporate ethics offices, work that used her observational skills and integrity in service of preventing fraud rather than just observing it powerlessly. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing, so this channel can reach more people like you. Now, back to the story. She became an advocate for protecting whistleblowers, especially those in low-status positions who observe wrongdoing but face barriers to reporting it. She worked with regulatory agencies to develop systems that encouraged and protected people in support roles who might observe criminal activity. She spoke publicly about how treating service workers as invisible and unimportant could blind organizations to the fact that those workers often see everything, understand more than executives assume, and possess both the evidence and the moral courage to bring wrongdoing to light when given appropriate channels and protections. Years later, when asked about the case, Maya would note simply that Sheikh Rashid's downfall was entirely self-inflicted. If he had treated her with basic respect, she might have continued questioning her own observations and remained silent about patterns that concerned her. But being called nothing, being treated with contempt, had crystallized her understanding that she had observed crimes and had a duty to report them. His assumption that mailroom workers were too unimportant to understand or act on what they saw had cost him everything, while ultimately serving justice by exposing fraud that had harmed thousands of investors and corrupted corporate governance.